So, step one, we went through this last week a little bit, and hopefully everybody got the link and was able to go through the screencast that I put up on how to set up your Twitter user to have a third-party application account, which is an what we call an OAuth consumer, and then those two keys that I lined out in the video are something that we're going to need in a little bit. So let's just go over some of that really quickly here, and then we'll go look at just the application from scratch in this first step. So OAuth again, OAuth is a way to permit a third-party application to act on your behalf as a user with resources on a website without knowing your credentials for that website. And where does OTweet, which is the application that we've whimsically named our Twitter application, where does that fit in this OAuth equation? OAuth calls it in different cases either consumer or client, and that means it's the third-party piece in between the user and the server. The user is also called something like a resource owner, which means that they own resources on the server which serves out those resources, and our application is going to be getting those resources or dealing with those resources in some way on the user's behalf. So that means we're acting as a consumer. So once again, we went through this last week, but let's go through it again so just everybody has a good understanding of how it works. Again, this is something like a kind of a simple sequence diagram. That means that the arrows pointing from the top of the screen to the bottom mean that the flow of that's basically time moving forward. So time is the x is across the y-axis. Sorry, I had to think about that for a second. And then the different actors, the user is on the left, the consumer application we're building is in the middle, the server's on the right. So as time goes forward, the user requests a protected resource, like say the home stream, all the tweets that they would get as a user if they went to the Twitter user page, or the Twitter page on the web and signed in as themselves. So at this point they're unauthenticated. Then the consumer application sees that we're trying to make a unauthenticated call. We're not authenticated yet. So it calls to the server and says that we want to get a request token, which will be a temporary set of tokens, keys, encrypted bits of information that we'll use to identify ourselves during this sign-in process for the user. And what the consumer application passes along are some keys called the consumer tokens, which are those tokens that I had you get when you went through the screencast that Twitter gave you as you sign up your application. And those consumer tokens basically identify your application to Twitter, so then Twitter knows that this is the application that's going to be the consumer during this set of requests. So then the Twitter will pass back the request token, which is this temporary set of keys to use during the authentication process before the user gets the access token assigned to them. So then, now that the consumer has the request token, it tells the user again to sign in through the server, and then the user authenticates on the server. And once that piece is done, the consumer will exchange the request token for an access token. And the access token is a more durable token, set of keys, set of encrypted bits of information that it will pass back and forth, or that it will pass to the server with every request, so the server knows what user the consumer is acting on behalf of. And now that authentication piece is done and we have the access tokens, we can store those away for every time we need to use them. And we can tell the user that we're all ready to go, and so then we can request the protected resource that the user requested initially. And as we pass along the access token, we can get that information from the server and serve it back to the user. And that's kind of how OAuth works, and what is going to be going on during the calls that we'll be making in the application during these steps. And again, if you sign up as an OAuth consumer, it's important that you pick the browser type of an application type on the sign-up page, or the edit page, as the case may be, and put in a callback URL of otweet.com authenticated. And you'll see where that fits in just a second. And the two important pieces of information we just talked about, the consumer key and the consumer secret key, are available to you on the application details page of your application that you sign up for. And I'll show you where to put those in our project in just a little bit. Okay, so kind of in summary of everything we've been talking about, OAuth, again, is just a protocol that eliminates the need for users to give passwords to third-party applications. Since we didn't really talk much about what code we're going to be going through in just a little bit, let me stop to see if there are any questions, any pressing questions about OAuth before we go look at the code for this first step.
All right. Ruth and Sarah, do you have any questions?
Yeah. How durable are the authentication tokens? Do they last between OTweet client sessions? For example,
Yes,
if I want
do.
my app to keep the user logged in forever, can I store an auth token?
Yep, and that's what we're going to be doing. Twitter, I didn't really dig too deeply, but I don't think they expire at any point. Like if the user goes to, if you're acting as a user, not as a third-party application developer, and then you can go see the applications that you've given permission to use your account, or to act on your behalf. Basically, you can go revoke an application, and then the tokens would no longer be valid, and there'd be some sort of error thrown by the Twitter4j library. I don't have that code path in the code for this application, just because just to keep things simple for showing on screen. But we could talk about that on the forums perhaps if we wanted to. Okay, so for those of you that were here for the class last time, the way that I did this was to basically type or copy and paste in a lot of code. And there's just too much code this time around to do that without a lot of song and dance. So basically I have this split out by week and by steps, all of the code that we're going to be going through. And so we're just going to be sort of touring the code and calling out interesting bits of information as we go forward. But I'm not going to be copying and pasting anything in, so just kind of a heads up for anybody who's expecting that to work the way we did it last time. So I have here the code for step 1 in authentication. Basically, this is just created from scratch with one simple activity and a little bit of a view created. So there's not a lot in this project so far in week 1. This will look like your application if you just generated this from scratch, or any other Android application. You'll see that I'm using the 2.1 SDK, and all of the things that were generated. Let's just kind of tour around in here. Inside the resources directory, we have an icon that was generated. We have some layouts that were automatically generated, and then I put in some, down in values here, I put in a strings.xml. Had a few things in it. I've made one or two changes in there, and those are all sort of standard files. Now, what you'll need to do when you generate your application, or unless you just look in the code, you won't find, as you download the source code, a raw directory inside resources, because I have that ignored from my source control system. Because again, this is something that you shouldn't share, your OAuth consumer tokens. So what you'll need to do when you set up your code is to go and create a raw directory inside the resources directory of your project, of all the projects that you check out, and then you can just copy it over to the other ones, and then create a file in that first time you create the raw directory called OAuth.properties. So I'm going to open up this one here, and it will look just like this. It's basically a Java properties file, and it has two keys. One is the consumer key, and one is the consumer secret key. And let me switch back to the slides. From the Twitter page that looks something like this, you will copy the consumer key and the consumer secret key and put them into the code in the appropriate places in this OAuth properties file. And that will be what you need to do to connect up with Twitter. So let's just kind of look at what we've got in the source. So far, we started out with a status list activity. And then if I open up the manifest, you'll see that the status list activity is our main intent and the launcher intent. So it's going to be the intent that's opened up by Android when we start the application every time. So it's going to sort of play a little bit of a double role as the part of the application that shows all the home tweets that the user gets, and also kind of traffic cop, because it has to decide whether or not we're signed in yet and possibly redirect the user into an authentication flow if the user's not signed in yet, or if we don't have those authorization tokens yet. So this should all be kind of familiar to you from last class. This is just basically the status list activity. One thing that I did differently is you'll see on line 6, this is an internet-based application, so we have to make calls out to the network. And to do that, we have to tell Android that we're using the internet. We need that permission from the user to use the internet. And again, that's something that they see before they download the application from the market. They see that this is one of the permissions that they need to agree to, that we're going to be using the network. And also, one interesting thing is I figured until we get to the class, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth class of this series, where we actually go into making the application look nice, I figured I'd change the theme to another, off the default theme to another theme that Android has available, which is the light theme, so things will be slightly different than just the standard black with orange highlights that we saw in the application we built last time. And let's see, what else is interesting inside here? Not much. So we've got a very simple, pretty much from scratch with just a few simple changes, application that's set up. Now let's look inside the status list activity. And you can see that's pretty much basic. That's exactly like it would look if we had just created this. It's setting the content view to that main layout that we created. And that's all it's doing. So there's not a lot going on there. And now let's look at the layout, because I did make some changes there, I think. Again, this is going to be, once the status list activity, once we're signed in and everything, is going to show the user's tweets. And we'll do that inside of a list view. So I've created a list view. And at the top there is a text view. No, I'm sorry, not at the top. This is the view that will show, again, using this Android special ID of Android:empty. This is the one that will automatically be shown by the list view if there's no data to be put into the list view. So we've got the list view, which is going to show all the tweets, and then if anything, if there's no tweets to show, then it will show this empty view instead. So let's go ahead and run what we've got so far and see what it looks like. It should look pretty simple. It'll just kind of be a smoke test. I'm running this in a 2.1 emulator. And once it starts up, it should just show that there are no tweets. So that means the empty view that we see here, this text view from line 10 to 15, is showing up because we don't have anything to show inside the list view. And everything's working well, and we've got a nice light theme instead of the dark theme. So we've got pretty much everything we expect to be working from this first step working. So let's go back and see if there are any questions for this first step.
We do have quite a few questions. One person asked, can you repeat where to put the keys of for the tweet developer? And I think they're talking about that raw OAuth properties file. Yes.
Sure. So in your project, inside the resources directory, which is called res, make a directory called raw. Raw is a standard directory that, here, if you look inside the gen directory, inside our package for the R, you can see that raw is automatically picked up by the pre-compilation phase, and it knows that there's a raw resource in there. Raw is a place to put any resources, just like you have a layout. You have layout resources, you have your string resources, your drawable resources, those kind of things. Raw is a place to put any other sorts of things, like maybe music files that you want to ship with the application, or some sort of configuration files like we're doing in this case. So I'm putting a standard java.properties file inside this raw directory, and we'll be loading that properties file later. So you need to go create this raw directory, and then you need to put a file called OAuth.properties in there, and then copy over the 2 keys from that page on Twitter into these standard Java property keys: consumer key, consumer seeker key.
Great, thank you. And this application that we're writing is the consumer, right? And somebody wants to know who is running the OAuth server, and that's Twitter, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And then somebody else asks how difficult it would be to implement all this OAuth stuff without the Twitter4j library.
Well, I don't know. It wouldn't be extremely hard. It's just kind of intricate. So that's one thing I was wondering if people were interested in kind of looking into, how to do this without that Twitter4j. But it's just so much extra code. Basically, Android works with a kind of modified Apache HTTP client version 4. So you'd have to write some networking code to use that HTTP client to make all the calls, and you'd have to know the right places to call in with Twitter, and pass around the right tokens in the right places in the header. And I'm not sure of what all those are, and it'd be a lot to go over right now anyway. But thank goodness for componentized. Thank goodness for jars that do all this stuff for us, right?
Exactly. Thank goodness. And then some people are also asking about the fact that we're using the web browser within the application, and kind of wanted to know sort of the reasoning behind that, and why, and what the difference is between if we use the browser versus if we build it ourselves.
So this will make a little bit more sense as I go forward, I think, and show you how the web browser is actually going to work. But one way or the other, we have to have the user sign in to Twitter. So we could instead of presenting a web view, we could make our own view, which basically said, hey, put in your Twitter username and password here, and then we would send that to Twitter. And if we, inside the setup, remember where I keep saying this, to set up our application as a browser application, if we set it up as a desktop application instead, then Twitter would go into a different flow, and it would pass back a PIN, PIN, personal identification number, or something like that. They would pass back a PIN instead of just signing the user in and redirecting. And then we would need to have the user go out to the web and get that PIN, and then put the PIN back into our application, and we would use the PIN along with our consumer token, or with the consumer tokens and request tokens, to say, okay, now the user signed in, and here's the PIN that you gave them. So it's just a more involved flow. And plus, there's the case where either you have to, so I said we could provide our own views for the username and password. You could do that, or you could kick the user out to a web browser and have them do it at that point and copy and paste back in the PIN, which would be kind of a pain on Android. So in either case, the user experience is just more involved and more confusing, and there's more places for the user to drop off. This way, since we can just present the user with the sign-in screen on Twitter and then catch the redirect, they don't have to do anything but sign in as they normally would. So this is a much better user flow.